I've spent the past 10 years rummaging through people's lives, trying to learn their most intimate moments and share them with the world, because that's what we awful journalists do. And as a writer and as an editor, I've chronicled a lot of difficult moments in people's lives. As you've heard, life is trouble. And among the stories that I've worked on is, for example, a story of a young man who decided to change his religion because his heart was broken. I worked on what happens to a family and a group of friends when a young director dies in a freak car accident just as his girlfriend is waiting for him outside his apartment. I've worked on a story of a man in his 60s who's led an incredibly amazing life, but still can't answer one fundamental question about his identity. Who am I? A Romanian? A Roma? Maybe something in between? I've worked on a story of a young woman looking for her long-lost stepsister, hoping she would prevent some of the heartbreak that she had to go through. These are not the kinds of stories we want to share with the world. They're private, they expose us, they make us vulnerable, they show people our weaknesses. And you don't want your weaknesses out there in the world. If I came up to you and said, hey, listen, tell me about the time in your life when it all went wrong, you will look at me and say, yeah, right. And what I found over these years of putting stories out into the world are two very interesting things. And one is that the people receiving those stories, let's call them the public, don't think of these characters as weak. They don't think of them as losers in the game of life. They think of them as tough. And secondly, the people sharing those stories, those painful stories, they don't experience extra hurt. On the contrary, sometimes this allows them to heal, maybe even recover a part of their lives. So this is what I came to talk to you about today. That stories can give us our lives back. And I'm going to try to convince you of that by sharing a painful story of my own that maybe together we can then unpack and see how we can unlearn these stories and relearn them in a different way. So my story starts in 9th grade. I used to spend my weekend nights in the local disco trying to work up the courage to ask girls to dance. And this almost never happened. But when it did, I rarely found anything better to say than, come here often? Or the even better, or should I say worse, do you have the time? You can imagine how well both of these worked. And on one of these nights, somewhere in the mid-90s, I was sitting in a corner checking out a group of girls when one of them walked up to me and asked me to dance. And I believe the song that was playing was George Michael's Jesus to a Child. I know. She asked me my name, told me hers, Carmen. She asked for my sign, Gemini, told me hers, Taurus. We danced, and at the end of the dance, she did something that has never happened to me before at that point. She kissed me with tongue, a lot of tongue. And it was great. And then she asked for my number. So I went home, and because I was waiting for Carmen to call, I didn't do something I had been doing for a few weeks at that time. And that is, I did not unplug the phone. You see, there was somebody else trying desperately to call our house at that point, and that was the school nurse. And the school nurse was trying to reach my parents and tell them that I had been missing classes like crazy and that I was this close to getting kicked out of school. So as you can imagine, because life is trouble, the phone rings, my parents make it to the phone faster. It's not Carmen, it's the school nurse. So after this call, we huddle in the kitchen, my mom, my dad, their record-breaking son, because apparently I had broken a school record for classes missed in 2 terms. And they were trying to figure out what happened. My parents are first-generation doctors. They come from working-class families, and they worked really hard to provide me and my brother with an easier life. And they couldn't understand what had happened to their son. So there I am in the kitchen with my parents, trying to explain to them what happened. And what was happening is that every morning, I would pretend to go to school. I would leave the house, circle the block a few times until my parents left for work, and then go back home to read. And I did not read any great literature, you have to understand me. I read a lot of science fiction, which is great literature, but I've also read a lot of nationalistic conspiracy thrillers and my mother's Sandra Brown books, which I used as training in case things progressed with girls like Carmen. And I'm okay now. So what I told my parents is that something happened when I started 9th grade. The new crop of teachers and students completely terrified me. And I was so terrified that when I was called on to speak, I could barely utter a word. Sometimes I would stutter through a sentence. It got so bad that I was barely able to pronounce my own name in class, and my colleagues were so very amused of the fact that I couldn't speak. So I stopped going. And the teachers weren't much helpful either. They called me stupid, gave me really bad grades. One predicted I would end up cleaning toilets for a living. And I was very alone, and this was a very shameful story, and I felt very guilty. And this is a story that I learned very well, and I learned very well not to tell, because it stuck with me. And here's the thing with stories, they stick with you. And the reason stories stick with you is because we are made of stories. We think in stories, we live in stories, we even dream in stories. And scientists have argued that stories are one of the keys to the survival of our species, because it allowed one caveman to tell the next, dude, there is a dinosaur down that path, and it is hungry, and you look tasty. And stories are the connective tissue between our past and our present. Think of all the great times in your life. They're all embedded in stories. Your grandma's chicken soup, that amazing hill you like to ski down on, the first time your baby talked. Your bad memories are embedded in stories too. A dog bite, the dark, that weird uncle that always has one too many drinks at a Christmas party. And our ability to create stories means we also create stories that hold us hostage, that trap us, like the story I told you. And the funny thing is, this doesn't happen just to individuals. This happens to communities too. We can't change our cities, we can't change our governments, we can't change our neighbors, because we've told ourselves stories about our inability to do so. Think of the Romanian story of Această, which is the quintessential example of not believing that change is possible. Think of these narratives at the level of a nation. Think of the Romanian national narrative, right? Or the ones that have been conquered, we're at the edges of Europe. And there's an Irish writer living in Bucharest who says that the Romanian national narrative depends on the fact that Romania be a victim. And you know the story, you've heard it, you might disagree with it, but we've learned it very well and have a hard time shaking off. So how do we shake off these stories that we've learned? How do we unlearn them and relearn them in a more positive way? How do we take control of these narratives and become more forgiving of ourselves, of our leaders, of our communities? In all these times, putting out stories into the world, I've found that there's 3 things we can do, and they're all pretty easy. And the first one is to listen. And when I say listen, I mean listen with your whole heart. Listen without judging. Listen without stepping in to give your opinion. Practice empathy, because empathy might be the best way for you to really understand what other people are going through. The Irish writer C.S. Lewis said, "We read to know we are not alone." And it took me years of reading and listening to other stories to realize I'm not the only one who's gone through a really bad time in high school. Just as you probably have learned over the years, you are not the only ones to have gone through a breakup. You're not the only ones to have lost a job. You're not the only ones to have lost a parent. And you already practice listening by the movies you watch, the books you read. But what I'm saying is that we should all practice it more consciously and conscientiously. Second thing we should do is start telling our own stories. Because apparently, if you go back to your life to tell your story, you might relearn it in a different light. And neuroscientists have been very adamant about this in recent years. They're arguing that in order to rewrite our painful memories, we have to go back and revisit them. There was this study that was done at Harvard recently by a group of psychologists who asked people, how much do you think you will change in the next 10 years? And you know, people and all of us have this very set story of our lives. We started here, we went all the way over here. The arc is pretty good, we have arrived at this point. We won't change very much, they said. Then they asked people, how much did you change in the past 10 years? And people said, oh, well, we changed a lot, actually. So here's the thing. There's a disconnect between the stories we tell of our future and the stories we tell of our past. And this presents a tremendous opportunity for relearning them. When I was in high school, I didn't think things would get any better. Not at all. I thought that was it, life's gonna suck from here on out. When I went back and relearned that story, I realized that just a year or two after, I started my own high school newspaper, which was ironically, or in a Freudian slip, called The Voice. And then I realized that pretty much everything I did over the course of my career is about trying to find ways to give voice to those that didn't have a voice, or help people that are not seen to be seen by others. So I was able to relearn that painful story and move it from something that was shameful into something that's an essential building block of who I am. The American writer Joan Didion says we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And what I take that to mean is that we tell stories in order to refashion our identities and regain some sense of agency over our lives. And we tell stories as a way of transforming who we are and taking some of our lives back. Okay, last one. I'm not advocating here for confession. Honesty is good, but I don't want us to turn this day into a big psychotherapy session. There's a more important reason that I believe stories are worth sharing. And that's because they put us back in touch with our communities. They allow us, in a way, to rejoin the world. And I've learned this recently from Michael Jackson, not the king of pop, a different Michael Jackson, who's a New Zealand-born anthropologist who teaches at the Harvard Divinity School, and who argues that stories bring us into our communities. They are a link between the private life and the public life. They disclose not just who we are, but what we have in common, and what shared circumstances bear upon our lives and our fate. And this is really important. That means stories are not just some individualistic things that we put out there in the world to make us feel better. They could be restorative social acts that could bring us together, make us understand each other, do great things together. So to recap, all of us have stories in our lives that hold us back. We can unlearn those stories and relearn them by going back, revisiting them, sharing them with the world. And this matters because we tell stories to get some of our lives back, while at the same time sharing them with others. Thank you.